Hello, and welcome to the session on smashing the ML stack for fun and lawsuits. My name is Ram. I'm from the Azure Trustworthy Machine Learning team, where my charter is to empower customers to think about developing and deploying machine learning systems securely. Kendra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kendra Albert. I'm an attorney at the Harvard Law School Cyber Law Clinic, where I practice and teach technology law, specifically the law around computer security.
This work was also done in coordination with Jonathon Penney from York University and Bruce Schneier from the Harvard Kennedy School. If you take one thing away from this talk, it should be that adversarial machine learning introduces really novel legal problems for security researchers. It's really, a lot of things are unclear, but the one certainty is that if you can start putting up technical defenses, it can actually help you with your legal claims. And this talk really has three parts to it. In the first part, I'm going to walk through a very high-level overview and a primer on what attacking machine learning systems entails. And then Kendra is going to deliver the meat of the talk about the legal implications for AI researchers and wrap it up with what a risk assessment of ML systems actually entails. So I'm going to start with a very brief quiz, and I don't want you to overthink it. I just want you to, just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind, or at least tell yourself the first thing that comes to your mind. Again, don't overthink this. What number is this? What kind of animal is this? And finally, would you clean your house with this? Well, if you said, 5, or, a bird, or some squiggly lines, well, congratulations, you are 100% human. And I know for a fact that your eyesight is not powered by machine learning. And that is because, for state-of-the-art machine learning systems, the first picture actually represents a 3. And the bird, which just by taking slightly and cropping and rotating in just like MS Paint, confuses state-of-the-art computer vision systems to misrecognize it as an orangutan. And that squiggly lines, according to a machine learning system, is actually a vacuum cleaner. Well, this is really what we're here to talk about. How an adversary can take systems and kind of add specific perturbations or even cause the ML system to have compromise in the confidentiality, integrity, and availability guarantees. And this is really what adversarial machine learning kind of focuses on. Now, this field goes back a really long time to the 1990s. But today, there's a boom in adversarial machine learning research. After a seminal paper that was published in 2016, researchers are kind of publishing on this topic front, right, and center. And you can really not escape any conference without adversarial machine learning being spoken about. And think about just like in Black Hat right now. And there's a whole lot of myth that adversarial machine learning is really just an academic pursuit and really does not have impact on real life. Well, that's not what the data shows. Commercial ML systems from Amazon to Microsoft to Google to Facebook have all had their machine learning systems kind of fooled, evaded, some of the ML models replicated, and some of the private training data recreated. So it's also not a myth that machine learning, these kind of attacks may only come to images. I showed you examples of images. You might have seen one in Tesla, but let's look at how it manifests in audio as well. So I'm gonna play you 2 samples, and I want you to tell me which one was tampered by with an adversary. Okay, I'm gonna start playing the first one. And now I'm going to play the second sample. So think of which one kind of an adversary tampered with in your mind. Well, if you said the second one, you're kind of out of luck, because the first one, if you pass it through Mozilla's state-of-the-art deep speech system, it actually transcribes to Alexa, order 100 frozen pizzas. And the second one really doesn't transcribe to anything. So with this in mind, I want to give you all the knowledge you would need to kind of appreciate the legal analysis that we've done. And the setup for this talk is a pretty vanilla pipeline of like machine learning systems. There's some sort of training data that is fed into an algorithm, and then you get a model at the end of it. And this could be like an image recognition system or a speech recognition system where you would pass, like, say, images as training data to an algorithm like say convolutional neural nets, get a model, and you as a user kind of like may submit a query of, say, an image and get a response whether the image contains a cat or not. Now, the assumption for this entire talk is that the attacker can only send queries and observe responses. She has no clue about, like, she has no access about like what algorithm the company is using, no special access to the training data or any architectural like insights about it. So this is what we call technically a black box attack. But again, just think that the attacker can only send queries and observe responses. Now, even with such a strict restriction on what the attacker can kind of do, there are a whole bunch of things that she can kind of achieve. The first one is called Evasion Tax. This is when an adversary is kind of like crafting specially crafted queries to the machine learning system, and then can control the response from the machine learning system. So in the classic case over here is like New York Times actually did a recent study on how the Chinese government is spreading propaganda on Twitter. What they found was that in order for to escape the Twitter's algorithm for flagging spam or not, the Chinese government essentially kind of appended random characters at the end of the tweet to confuse the algorithm. This was also seen in another attack wherein researchers from Skylight essentially confused Cylance's machine malware evasion system by appending benign code into WannaCry ransomware. And therefore the machine learning system also classified that as benign-ware. The second example is poisoning attack. Here, the adversary is able to take advantage of the fact that machine learning systems constantly take the responses and use that as feedback into their system. Over here, the adversary is corrupting the training data of the algorithm. The study over here is like Microsoft's T example, wherein like it was supposed to emulate a sweet 16-year-old personality using like state-of-the-art conversational like algorithms. But when trolls from Reddit and 4chan descended onto Twitter, essentially the bot was corrupted, and then it went from a 16-year-old personality to this like bigoted like bot, and Microsoft had to yank it within 24 hours of deploying Tay. These were all attacks that kind of like incorporated like low-skilled adversaries. There can also be high-skilled adversaries can cause more damage. The first one is model inversion, wherein the attacker recovers the underlying private training data used in the model by, again, sending carefully crafted queries and observing the responses. And over here, you can see like a study wherein just, again, by interacting with the machine learning system in a black box style setting, the adversary was able to reconstruct the private training data that could potentially lead to loss of privacy in this particular example. And finally, there's model stealing attack. Over here, like 2 years ago, OpenAI released a model called GPT-2, which is the precursor to GPT-3. And when they released it, that they said that they are not going to release a full model immediately, and they're going to take a staged approach because it was too dangerous to release into the public immediately. Again, when you say that you cannot do something, people on the internet get very excited. And researchers were able to replicate the ML model by using open source information and proxy models and replicate GPT-2. So to put it all together, here's what I want you to take away so far. there are a spate of attacks that can happen just by querying the model and observing the responses. So that would be like inversion, which is reconstructing the private training data, model stealing, as well as model evasion. And then if you can corrupt the training data, that's called model poisoning. So the big thing so far is, why haven't people actually solved this problem yet? Like, this has been known for a long time. What's stopping us from actually doing this? So the sad story is that most defenses today are broken. Um, there's every time like a paper gets published about like, hey, we have solved the defense, just within like a couple of like months at this point in time, there are researchers that come up with saying like, that's really not the case. In fact, Nicholas Carlini is kind of like really a researcher from Google, who actually has a video up on his site when he cracks like a state-of-the-art defense within 2.5 hours, and you can kind of stream it. It's like as long as what a Bollywood film would take without the songs. So unfortunately, like state-of-the-art machine learning systems do not have the defenses to back these sort of attacks.
Thanks, Ram. So all of that is in some ways the background you need to understand better why there are novel legal problems involved in adversarial machine learning research and what the legal risks are for adversarial machine learning researchers. Before I get into that, obligatory disclaimer, which is that I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney, which is to say that this presentation does not create a lawyer-client relationship between us. And I'm going to sort of focus on these legal risks from the perspective of an adversarial machine learning security researcher, since those are the folks I often represent. But at the end, I'll talk a little bit about why I think that actually helps us better understand what folks who are interested in defending adversarial machine learning systems also need to do. So in terms of the novel legal questions, or why this is sort of an interesting topic from a legal perspective, it's because, of what Ram said, which is that there isn't a ton of novel access involved in submitting a query and viewing the response. And that also there's sort of this question of whether these machine learning manipulated images, so for example, this one that someone has manipulated to turn a panda into a gibbon, should be treated differently than the actual photo of a gibbon, right? Whether there's actually whether trying to trick a machine learning system actually should be legally punished in the same way that we might think about more what I would call traditional hacking activity. So to answer that question, we're going to look at a bunch of different bodies of US law. So the applicable bodies of law that we'll discuss are breach of contract, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, copyright infringement, anti-circumvention law, which is called Section 1201 for those in the know, and then finally misappropriation of trade secrets. So the first body of law is sort of the most broad and potentially the most applicable, and that's breach of contract. So contracts might sound like a bit like abstract or old-fashioned, but as most of you probably already know, you sign contracts for online services all the time, or you agree to them, including the terms of service, an end user license agreement, or even something like an acceptable use policy, which is incorporated into the terms of service for these platforms. And they all govern what you can do with a website or with an API. They're about your responsibilities to the API service provider and the API service provider's responsibility to you. They govern even if you don't read them. So, this is not a thing where you can close your eyes and press I agree and say, I wasn't bound by the contract. It doesn't work. Courts don't like that. Indeed, these policies are binding regardless of whether you actually know the full contents of what's in them. What's important is that you were on notice that they existed and that you had the opportunity to learn what the full contents were. So why does this impact adversarial machine learning researchers? Is there something in the contract that says no adversarial machine learning? Well, generally, from what I've seen, no. But contracts often prohibit reverse engineering, which many adversarial machine learning attacks, specifically model inversion and model stealing, do. So this, for example, is from the FACE++ terms of service, and in section 3.5.4.14, is it any wonder nobody reads these things? It prohibits conducting reverse engineering, disassembling, or decompilation of the services. So model inversion or model stealing attacks for those purposes might be violations of the terms of service for this site. So to sort of sum up what this means, what you would look at in terms of a contract in order to evaluate this, because every contract's different. For an evasion attack, the types of provisions that might create liability are sort of acceptable use policies around what types of query you can submit or the truthfulness of your queries. Some service providers require you to warrant particular things with regards to queries that you submit. For model inversion and model stealing, anti-reverse engineering clauses are the big thing you're going to worry about. For model stealing, potentially using the ML system to violate the rights of others. And then finally, for poisoning attacks, you're worried about anti-reverse engineering and clauses that protect the intellectual property, so IP, of the API owner or prohibit causing harm. And you'll see this basically version of this table for pretty much each of our various bodies of law that we go through. That's why we wanted to tee up these 4 types of attacks, because we analyzed each of the attacks under each body of law. Okay, so how is this a novel problem when I basically said that you might have agreed to a contract with a service provider that prohibits all kinds of adversarial machine learning? Aren't we done? Aren't all adversarial machine learning researchers going to jail? Well, not quite. So fundamentally, violating a contract doesn't necessarily create the kinds of penalties that I think we can often really worry about, especially for individual security researchers. So if you violate a contract with one of these service providers, oftentimes the worst thing they're going to do is just kick you off the service. They may sort of not give you back money and credits if you've bought credits on the service, or if you have sort of an ongoing monetary relationship, they may not give you a refund. Honestly, sometimes they might. But really, breach of contract by itself, it's not the end of the world when it comes to legal risk, especially when what you're thinking about is potentially individual security researchers who are testing attacks and defenses, because you often are not going to have a financially important enough relationship with these service providers such that bringing a lawsuit for breach of contract is worth their time and energy. So although breach of contract is the most relevant body of law, right, it covers the most behavior that we see under adversarial machine learning, it's often going to be the lowest actual substantial risk that adversarial machine learning researchers face. The same is unfortunately not true of our next body of law, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is the U.S. federal anti-hacking statute. The war games reference here is not just because I don't know what hacking looks like, but because there are scholars who actually theorize that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was passed as a result of war games, right? The sort of fear of what hacking looks like comes from this particular form of media. And the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act has historically been interpreted quite broadly. And in fact, there used to be conflicting interpretations across the United States, where some places would have risk associated with violating terms of use. So we didn't really worry as much about breach of contract, but when it sort of started involving this Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which has both criminal penalties, aka you could go to jail, and potential civil liability risk, aka someone could sue you, that was worrying. That changed about a month and a half ago with Van Buren v. United States, which was the first Supreme Court case to substantively interpret the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And it's really good news for computer security researchers, because although there are certain things about the law that it definitely did not clarify, it does make more clear that sort of merely violating the terms of use of a site by engaging in a practice that might be reverse engineering, for example, or by sharing your Netflix password, if that's against the Netflix terms of service, which I'm pretty sure it is, that doesn't make you potentially violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. However, there's still risk to security researchers that comes from the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, even post Van Buren. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So there's 2 provisions of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that are relevant to this analysis. One is what's called an access violation. So this is section 1030A2C for those of you who want to follow along at home. And this prohibits accessing a computer without authorization or in a way that exceeds authorized access, and as a result, obtaining any information. So, when we talk about any information here, we're not necessarily like, oh gosh, you have to exfiltrate this payload. Just basically accessing a computer without authorization or in a way that exceeds authorized access sort of counts. That any information bit is very easy for someone suing you to show. The other provision of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that's relevant here is what's called a damage violation. So this is causing damage to a computer without authorization by knowingly transmitting a program, information code, or command. So this is, again, for those following along at home, Section 1030A5A. And that's the provision that's meant to deal with things like viruses, malware, that sort of thing. So with these two provisions, the key question with regards to the access violation is, when are you accessing a computer without authorization or in a way that exceeds authorized access? And this brings us to a point around technological barriers. So circumventing a technological barrier, even if it's not particularly effective, can potentially create Computer Fraud and Abuse Act liability. So, when I talk about this, especially with security experts, they're kind of like, oh my God, do I need the latest, greatest defenses? Well, I mean, maybe, but not necessarily for the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I mean, there is case law suggesting that even an IP block on certain internet protocol addresses could allow you to claim that someone was circumventing a technological barrier. In the language of Van Buren, the Supreme Court case, it's a sort of gates up, gates down analysis. We'll figure out what that means at some point. That's good news, right? Merely violating the terms of service, if the API you're attacking doesn't do anything to prevent you, no CFAA liability. Circumvention of a technological barrier, maybe. And until courts rule otherwise, the other thing that is good to know about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is it may still be that individual revocation of the right to access creates liability. Okay, well, what does that mean? So let's say that you're a researcher and the company whose API that you've been attempting to test for a particular attack figures out that it's you and sends you a letter. And this happens, I've seen them, saying, can you stop that, please? You are no longer authorized to access our service. That may still create risk for these first three types of attacks under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, because that's a revocation of access and your access is no longer authorized. The last thing to note here is that 1030A5A, right? I said that was the virus and malware part of the CFAA, and that most directly applies to poisoning attacks, because poisoning attacks aim to shift the underlying system to respond differently to sort of input from other users later. They're less about getting information out of the system or evading a particular outcome on the API query level. So that's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I'm next going to talk about copyright law, then trade secret, and then we'll move into takeaways. So many of you are probably familiar with copyright law, even if that just means that you know that you don't like it. But it protects original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium. And that way that interacts with software is rather interesting. So copyright law doesn't protect the idea of software. It doesn't protect sort of the notion of adding two numbers together or the notion of a program that does a particular thing. It protects software as a literary work. So the actual code that someone writes, the source code, that's protected under copyright law. That means that something like back-end code for a machine learning model may be protected by copyright, but generally models themselves, the weights that are given to particular parameters, are not protected by copyright. There's also potentially copyright claims around image-based training data. So images, pictures of people are copyrightable. And so what that means is that if you're doing something like extracting images that were used as part of training data from a model via queries, you may have a copyright law problem on your hand if you get sufficiently good high-resolution images out. This is not a big problem if you're a security researcher who's sort of interested in demonstrating these kinds of attacks and you're not sort of necessarily reproducing these images a ton other than in a paper. But it does mean that using sort of model inversion attacks to sort of extract training data for the use of training your own model could create copyright law risk. The next bit of copyright law worth mentioning is Section 1201, which we often mention sort of aligned with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It likewise creates liability for circumventing technological protection mechanisms, specifically those that protect copyrighted works. So, if you're old like me and you ever thought about cracking the encryption on a DVD so you could sort of make a copy and share it or not share it on the internet, that's what we are thinking about when it comes to anti-circumvention provisions like Section 1201. And again, here, the question is, if depending on the safeguards that are provided for the API, you may have a circumvention problem. And that means, again, like you'll hear me emphasize a lot, that the certain kinds of defenses that make it more difficult for attackers to engage in these kinds of attacks may not just make it more difficult, but also may create opportunities to bring for people whose APIs are being attacked to bring legal claims should they seek to do that. The final form of intellectual property I want to discuss is trade secret. So trade secret is kind of like the one that everyone forgets because it's often very relevant for businesses, but not very relevant for professors. And so when we talk about trade secret, we're talking about something that gives you a business advantage and that you keep secret. So that the archetypal example is the formula for Coca-Cola. And it's really useful to think about trade secrets in relationship to machine learning models, because machine learning models, they're not necessarily protected by copyright, but they could be something that a company keeps secret in order to sort of get a business advantage. And to the extent that that's true, model stealing and model inversion attacks could implicate trade secret law if a company has adequately protected that trade secret. If they haven't, you don't have a trade secret at all. So misappropriation of trade secrets, stealing trade secrets, doesn't cover run-of-the-mill reverse engineering. If I can just look at it and figure out how it works, then trade secret isn't going to help me. But it does cover what's called unlawful means. Now, I wish we had case law where I could tell you pretty clearly whether model inversion or model stealing is an unlawful means. Frankly, we don't. But what we do see here is that more protections create potential trade secret claims. But if you're just sort of able to get the information without really doing much special at all, then it's very difficult for the owner of a trade secret to claim rights in it and claim that you misappropriated. One last thing to note about trade secret is that trade secret misappropriation the damages, like basically how much money you can get if your trade secret has been misappropriated, has to do with the sort of either your lost profits or the sort of money that the person made by using the trade secret. So what this means in practice is that security researchers who aren't doing anything with the model that they stole, or the model that they were able to extract, or the training data, are unlikely to have really the same kinds of significant trade secret liability, although they may be, again, ordered to stop doing what they're doing. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour through a lot of law. You made it. So let's talk a little bit about some high-level takeaways before we turn to what all of this means for folks who might be building or defending machine learning systems. So just to boil this down to the highest possible level, I have created this very helpful chart with a line that says less risk to more risk, noting here that evasion attacks just tend to be much lower risk than something like model stealing or model inversion, and poisoning, because it has potential negative implications for other users of the service, aka it can harm other people, tends to be the highest risk of the 4 types of attacks that we've talked about that don't require any sort of special knowledge, that just use API queries. Then, for security researchers who are doing this work and curious about how to lower their risk in doing adversarial machine learning work, here's some stuff that's less risky and some stuff that's more. Testing with permission, or testing on systems that are not training on API query data, right? So that there's no feedback loop. Those tend to be less risky. Likewise, testing on systems that are isolated or not used by other users, and following security best practices, including potentially coordinated vulnerability disclosure as appropriate. All that gives you less risk. More risk, testing without permission, testing on live systems, including software as a service services, testing on systems that have a feedback component. Again, you're not always going to know whether the system is continually training on the inputs, but if you do know that it is, and testing a poisoning attack could really screw up things for other users, that's going to be much more legally risky. And then finally, the overall thing that I want to communicate in terms of legal risk is if you're using adversarial attacks to extract information for business purposes, especially competition, that increases your risk quite significantly. So that's for my security researcher friends. Let's talk a little bit about my defenders. So one thing that we noticed when we started doing this work is there's this sort of belief that the law is what's going to save us all from adversarial machine learning attacks. So this is a blog post from 2016 from the Big ML blog, where they say, even if stealing software was easy, there's still an important disincentive to do so in that it violates intellectual property law. Well, that's true for some values of the word software. But the reality is that actually the law is not a perfect fit for all of the types of harms that might come from adversarial machine learning attacks. Honestly, that's probably a good thing in some ways, because many of these attacks actually the thing that you're doing when you do them are not exclusive to attackers. And looking at the harm really is what helps us distinguish folks who are genuinely bad actors from folks who are just testing something or may just, accidentally submit the wrong photo to an API. One of the ways companies have been trying to protect themselves so far is terms of service. Fortunately for security researchers, violating terms of service no longer creates what I call follow-on legal risk, which is you may still have a breach of contract claim, but you can't now invoke the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the same way you could previously. That means that machine learning providers need to think about what harm attacks are actually causing and use the legal tools that are consistent with those harms, whether that's copyright or trade secret. And frankly, this is good because those tools actually encourage folks to implement defenses, because technical defenses, even if they're not foolproof, even if Nicholas Carlini can break them in 2 hours, they can potentially create liability for bad actors. So in a way, the sort of not so perfect fit of parts of law to adversarial machine learning actually is creating circumstances in which folks are encouraged to secure their machines and their APIs. And that's really what we want, is for folks to build more secure systems. Thank you. And Ram and I are always happy to talk about this more or answer questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like to talk about any of the things we discussed.